Hey, it's your girl Olivia, and today I'm going to teach you about 6 basic principles that will really make your animations pop. These principles are, in order, timing, spacing, easing, arcs, anticipation, and straight ahead versus pose to pose. Let's get started! You can use a variety of programs. PC programs include Clip Studio X, Toon Boom Harmony, Krita, OpenTunes, and TupiTube. It is worth noting, I have never used the last two. The list of apps that I know about for the iPad or phone are Flip-A-Clip, ToonSquid, upcoming Procreate Dreams, and Rough Animator. I have never used anything other than Flip-A-Clip for apps, so I don't really know how the other people work. And of course, if you have a stack of sticky notes, you can animate along using a sticky note flipbook, or tracing paper with a light board, whichever way you prefer. The first basic principles often go together like peanut butter and jelly. That is to say, they are inseparable. But the way timing works is simply where the animation plays in the timeline, and for how long you expose your drawings to new frames or lack thereof. This is called animating on 1s, 2s, and 3s. 1s means that there's a drawing on every frame, 2s is every other frame, and 3s is one new drawing every 3 frames. Here I have this pendulum. It is not correctly timed. However, let's see what it looks like when it is correctly timed. Pretty cool, huh? Here are the timelines of each respective timing. One final thing before we move on is smear frames. Smear frames are when your drawings are so fast that motion blur occurs. These can be any shape and size, but it's still important to keep the principle of animation in mind. Now let's talk about spacing. Spacing is how far apart or how different the drawings are from frame to frame. This box is moving from point A to point B. Notice something though? That's right, the box looks, say it politely, kinda messed up. That's okay though, because there's something that could potentially save it from looking like, that. That's by adjusting the spacing. Let's show the adjusted spacing. Ah, perfect. It looks so much better. Spacing matters a lot in this situation. Here's how the spacing works on the bad example. You can see how inconsistent the spacing is, meanwhile, here's how the spacing works on the good example. It's more consistent to how the actual physics works, which you always need to keep in mind when doing this. Something important to think about when spacing your animation is the next segment, easing. Easing is essentially speeding up and slowing down the motion in accordance with the physics. Look at this ball bounce without easing. Very static and not very good. But let's take a moment to look at the ball bounce with easing. Let's break this down. You start by easing out by spacing the drawings closer, and it gets further and further away as you go along. There are certain situations where you don't ease the animation at all, such as when you hit the ground or like a wall, or when something gets completely halted, it just doesn't ease in that position. It'd be kind of weird if a bowling ball was just slowed down before the ground, although it'd be kind of cool to fall down an entire canyon and not die without, parachute. Regardless, the ball squashes. The way I like to animate squash and stretch, which, by the way, I will make a tutorial about this one of these days, is by easing the squash by a bit, and then when it goes out, stretching it to make the motion faster. You ease out into a stretch, and you ease in to a squash. Generally, that's how I animate. The spacing of the ball gets smaller and smaller until it stops when it gets to the top of the cycle, and the cycle continues. Next up, we have arcs. Motion rarely moves from one end to the other in a straight line, robots being like the only exception. Let's say we had a cannon that shot balls. With less force, the ball would make a very narrow arc, thanks to gravity, but with more force, the arc gets wider and larger. Also, joints move in an arc. You get the point, you dummy. Things move in a curve or an arc, and you should be able to recreate that in animation. These get exponentially more complex as you get more experience. Here is a motion curve I made for one of the multi-animated projects I'm making right now. Anticipation is an interesting one. It's not always necessary for every situation, but it's used a lot in more realistic and very cartoony animation. It's an interesting one because it's not noticeable at all in 99% of the places where it's used. An unsung hero of animation, if you will. Anticipation is a principle where the character or animation does a small action before starting a bigger movement, mostly to foreshadow the coming movement. When you think of somebody throwing a ball, they move their arm back and then they throw the ball. That's anticipation. My logo animation has anticipation, where Adam looks up to foreshadow the ball coming down, and then also to foreshadow the smear frame when it's coming out. Finally, straight ahead versus pose to pose. Pose to pose is where you draw the key poses first and then fill in the gaps. The kinds of frames you can expect are keys, breakdowns, which are very important, but I think that'll come in a different video, extremes, and then finally, in-betweens. In-betweens are very important too. There are some movements with very little in-betweens, and it also depends on your style. I like having in-betweens because I like my own style to be fluid and smooth. But there is another method that is kind of like a flip book, where you just keep on drawing one drawing after another. The unique advantage of this is that the next frame will be more unexpected, spontaneous. But the mass of these, the volume of these, will be extremely difficult to keep consistent and be very different from where it started unless you are a godlike animator like James Baxter. Keyframing is very good for motion that's planned out and keeps consistency better, but it's not as spontaneous or fun to look at if you do it wrong. I love the Owl House, but oh my god, the animation is so goddamn stiff. What the heck? Most animators do straight ahead for hair, cloth, and other gravity-affected parts, as well as special effects. Pose to pose, however, is used for pretty much everything else, especially character animation and more rigid animation. Before this video ends, there's one final thing I want to ask of you. I will be giving you homework. Try your best to implement at least 3 out of the 6 principles I shared with you in one animation. Use hashtag ZendermanHomework on Instagram or YouTube if you want to share it with me. Here's my animation using 3 of the principles. I hope y'all enjoyed the video and that you were able to gain some more insight into how animation works so that you can improve your own animations. Until next time!